The Competition Commission has released its final recommendations in its public transport market inquiry report. Now, it's critical of government and transport authorities for sidelining taxi operators and small bus companies and ignoring rural areas that don't have railway networks. Joining us to unpack some of the findings is Competition Commissioner Tembinkosi Bonakele. Good evening, Mr. Bonakele, and thank you so much for your time. Firstly, let's just begin with some of the key anti-competitive behavior that you've been able to identify through the study.
Well, there's a couple of them, Kathy. The first one is what you have referred to, which is a very skewed incentive system or subsidy system. This is money that is provided by government to service providers. This tends to exclude taxis. Minibus taxis transport more than 66% of commuters every day of work in South Africa, and this means that those commuters and those service providers are not covered at all. And you must remember that taxis actually do compete. They don't just compete with one another, but they compete with other modes of transport. They compete with buses, which are often subsidized, and they compete with trains. And so that's a major issue. The others have to do really with policy. So there is a lot of issues we are raising about, for example, a conflict of interest that exists within the structure of PRASA. PRASA operates a bus service, so a long-distance bus service, Translux and City to City are operated by a subsidiary of PRASA Autopex. The same company also controls an intermodal facility in Johannesburg, which is essential, and that is Park Station. And they have been accused of price discrimination as well as limiting access to other bus operators that compete with their downstream operations. So all of those things have a very direct impact on competition, and we point them out in the report.
So just from a very superficial reading of the report in terms of what you're raising now, the railway infrastructure, a significant portion of government monies and subsidies seems to go towards rail. When you look at the actual output of the service and perhaps even some of the challenges that have plagued the industry over the last couple of years, is there good value in terms of return on investment on that money?
It depends on where you are, Kathy. If you are probably sitting in a place with a high coverage, such as the Western Cape, city of Cape Town in particular, you may say that it is worth it. But if you are sitting in Limpopo or somewhere in the eastern part of the Eastern Cape, the former Transkei, your answer will be vastly different, because those areas we know that have very limited coverage. So commuter rail transport less than 10% of commuters per day, and yet it receives the highest subsidies. So what it means is that those subsidies only go to areas where there is rail infrastructure, and it leaves the majority of commuters in South Africa, particularly those who are in poorer areas that tend to be the areas that are not covered by rail. Those will not be covered. But there's also really extreme inefficiency. So if you look at a service like Metro Rail and Gautrain in Gauteng, essentially you can see that the Gautrain is a train for the rich and Metro Rail is a train for the poor. They even separate the station. So if you go to Pretoria Station, there's literally a fence between the terminals of these two trains. That's a super inefficiency, because a train is supposed to be a mass people mover. And so you want to maximize volumes and integrate it. And these are some of the things that we're calling for in the report.
So it sounds to me that there's a lot of suggestions in terms of revising existing policy that government is going to have to look at. And you spoke about the amount of monies that are given to the taxi industry in the form of subsidies and I believe that those currently are hovering around 1%. The case has long been made by the taxi industry to receive greater subsidies. It has also long been promised from the part of government. Do you think that the study will provide some kind of framework to finally move that conversation into the next level?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't underestimate that it is a complex policy question, but I think that it will certainly point government towards a particular direction. Certainly, insofar as the need to address the inequity, because there's clearly an inequity. So what you call 1% subsidies to taxis, this is the taxi recapitalization that people get when they take their old taxis for scrapping. Is hardly you can hardly call it a subsidy, actually. So there is almost zero subsidy to taxis. I hear now that there is some form of assistance that will be given to taxis as a result of the lockdown, and try and compensate them for the prolonged lockdown. But we are yet to see what the numbers are looking like in relation to other modes of transport that have been receiving subsidies. We also know that the department is currently developing a subsidy policy. But there are challenges, Kathy. As I've said, I'm not underestimating those. We know that this is a highly informal sector, and subsidies do require some kind of a formality, and all of that work needs to be done by government.
Buses also play a significant role within our transport sector, whether publicly or privately operated. What has been the findings of the Commission around the use of buses, and most importantly, the kind of support that they are receiving?
Well, it varies. There are independent buses that don't receive subsidies at all. And again, there we're finding that a lot of subsidies tend to disadvantage rural areas. But the biggest finding we made with respect to buses, there's two of them. One is that there are long-term contracts for some of the established brands and operators of these buses that have been receiving subsidies over many years, many decades, actually, a couple of decades actually, without ever going out on tender. And so what that does is it entrenches the incumbents and keeps the newcomers out, and increases the barriers of entry into that market. So we're calling for government to issue tenders for those contracts so that everybody can be able to compete, and actually also set aside some of the routes for smaller bus operators. We're recommending a minimum of 30% that it must be set aside for small operators to give them some opportunity. The second big finding is that the so-called BRT, which applies to cities and some of the larger towns, has in fact not worked very well. We think that there is a design issue there that needs to be addressed. It tends to be inefficient in terms of the routes that have been chosen, but also I think it leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to integration. We think that it can also help to integrate the taxi operators into the system.
Just before I let you go, what are you expecting to come out of this report now that it has been completed?
Well, it's really the first really comprehensive study of the entire public transport in the country. We hope that policymakers will take it serious, because, as you rightly pointed out, it's very polycentric. A lot of these interventions are going to require the policymaker. The report will be submitted to the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, and he is required to table it before Parliament within 10 days of receiving it. And we hope that various committees of Parliament will then engage with the report and will assist in ensuring that its findings and recommendations are implemented. But the biggest people that this report is directed towards is the National Department of Transport as well as some of the transport authorities at a provincial and local government level.
All right. Well, we'll certainly look out for some of the developments around this report. Competition Commissioner Tembinkosi Bonakele.